Well, thanks for joining me for another episode. And we're going to talk about another problematic financial behavior, which is called underspending. And this is probably one of the behaviors that's can be most difficult to get our arms around. I know the first time I ever heard of a problematic behavior being underspending, I was kind of like, what? I mean, get a grip. This is how you build wealth, right? You need to be frugal. You need to save for the future. You need to live on less than you make. And this is one of the things that I will tell clients that, too many Americans are overspending, right? We would be in a lot better shape if folks were underspending. In fact, frugality is a really important concept of building wealth. It's the common denominator that I find with most of my clients that do accumulate wealth, more than the job they have, what they invest in, anything else, whether they buy real estate or stocks, whether they use leverage or not. The real common denominator is the ability to be frugal, to live that on less than we make. So how can underspending then possibly be a problem? And I think the fact that I am money vigilant in the categories we've talked about, the 4 categories of money scripts: money avoidant, money worship, money status, money vigilant. A money vigilant would definitely more have this attitude than any other category of money scripts. So it's true, right? First, let's say it's true that accumulating wealth requires us to live on less than we earn. And frugality is important. But let's not confuse living on less than you make with underspending. Okay, underspending is quite a bit different than being frugal. If you can think of this, maybe underspending is frugality on steroids. So it's more than just being frugal. It's starting to be frugal to the point that it's harmful to the person. So this is the real thing that we got to look for in underspending. And I think of this where you have a situation, say like Scrooge did in Charles Dickens' Christmas Carol. He is a classic example of an underspender. He was far beyond being frugal. He lived without adequate food. He didn't have enough heat or furnishing. And in the light of the fact that he had great wealth, right, at his disposal, and yet he chose a lifestyle of the impoverished that actually, one could argue, put his health at risk. So I think that's, for me, is what comes up when I think of an underspender. Now, usually the view of Scrooge is the one at the beginning of the book, of a real hard-hearted, steely, cold, mean-spirited guy. And at the end of the book, quite frankly, he got transformed and became much more balanced in everything in life. But we do have these underspenders living amongst us who are probably much more personable than Scrooge. So this is an important thing to understand, that underspending typically results in people failing to get adequate medical care, eat a healthy diet, live in well-maintained homes or apartments, where they basically refuse help or support that could make life safer and make life easier for them. I'm thinking of an example of some folks I knew. We'll call them Martin and Eleanor. They worked all their lives, managed to save $2 million, and are 72 years old. They, when they hit retirement, they started taking out a very conservative withdrawal rate of 3%, which means they took out $60,000 a year from their portfolio to live on. Well, at least that's what they started with. So the problem is they decided, instead of taking $60,000 a year, that they did that for a year or so and decided that was way too much money. And they reduced that to $10,000. So they add that to the $30,000 that they get from Social Security, and they're living on $40,000 a year. And they just said, basically, we don't need all that money. We don't need $60,000 from our portfolio, $30,000 from Social Security, which would be $90,000. We can get along on $40,000 a year. Well, after a year or two of this, I began to notice that there was a problem with that. Both of them were neglecting their health. They got annual checkups from their doctor, but those are covered by Medicare, yet they don't go to a dentist and haven't been for several years. Eleanor really needed hearing aids, and if you know about what those cost anymore, $6,000, $7,000 isn't unusual for a good set of hearing aids. And she told me, that's just way too much money. So she didn't have the hearing aids that she needed. Martin's eyesight was beginning to fail, and driving at night was difficult, but they still insist on driving thousands of miles in the car to visit children because airline fares are just outrageous in the way they look at it. They drive old cars that don't have some of the new safety features. They have started having problems finding their car in a parking lot. There's all sorts of new electronic help that can be employed to where this isn't an issue. There can be, even Teslas today can almost drive themselves. And Teslas start in the $40,000, not an unheard of amount of money for a middle-income car, but they won't spend the money because cars cost way too much. They sleep on a mattress that's 20 years old. I think conventional wisdom says 10 years is about the most for a mattress. Their house needed paint. When I went out and took a look at that, when I started suspecting all this, the house had disrepair, planks, boards out of their porch where somebody could easily fall through, wires that were exposed in the house that needed some work. Only 2 burners worked on their kitchen stove. But it wasn't a big problem, except at Thanksgiving when the family comes to visit. So This is what we're talking about when we're talking about underspending. They could more than afford all of this and never run out of money in their lifetime. So what's the cure? Well, the cure isn't to run out and start spending money on things that don't add value, or to spend money. And this isn't going to happen anyway, because a person like this is not, you can say you need to spend more money, and that's not going to happen, right? I can think of another couple that was in a similar position. They were probably living on about the same 40,000-50,000 a year. They could afford to have an income triple of that. And I said, is there anything that you'd like to do, like a world cruise or a number of things, experiences? And they just couldn't think of anything that would really add value to their life. So it's not spending money to spend money. It's spending money to actually start making your life certainly safer. So what's going on here? This is not a problem that can be solved logically. It really can't be solved by showing somebody over and over and over that they really can afford to spend more. That's not the issue. It goes much deeper than this. And the problem is that the cause of this seemingly illogical behavior is some type of an emotional trauma. And when we have an emotional trauma causing a situation, the cure is typically not cognitive. It's been cognitive. They would have been told they're underspending. Look at all these safety issues in your life. And they would have gone, oh, wow, we can afford these. Great. Okay, we'll start withdrawing the full $50,000 a year or 60,000 and take care of all this. Okay. So I've had a podcast before on financial trauma and covered this, but I think I want to review a little bit of it. That when you hear the word trauma, what do most of us think of, right? And it's typically something big like the death of a loved one, severe injury or illness, some type of natural disaster, physical, sexual abuse, etc. But trauma doesn't have to be that extreme. It can be a lot of small things that happen. The Greek word for trauma is wounding. All right. And so traumas can be somewhat light, small in their intensity, but we can have many of those over a period of years, and they can become much greater, much bigger in nature. And traumas can be both physical and emotional in nature. I think most of us are familiar with post-traumatic stress disorder called PTSD, and it can cause symptoms like anxiety, depression, flashbacks, nightmares, things like that. So your less extreme traumas can just come from shock, upheaval in your life, distress, financial distress, chronic stress, heartache from a number of sources. There can just be a whole number of things that can count as trauma. And by this standard, there isn't a human past the age of 2 that hasn't experienced some type of trauma. So, what does trauma have to do with money? Well, because money touches everything we do, it's involved in every aspect of our life. Any type of distressing or disturbing experience, especially financial, can overwhelm someone and become a traumatic event. So with money, chronic worry or fear around money can impact a person emotionally, to where there would just be great fear around spending it, sudden changes in financial circumstances, being controlled, manipulated, gaslighted by a parent or a partner, shame over financial decisions. Any of these can become a wounding that results in the symptom being underspending. So now consider this in an IFS, internal family systems lens, right? Where there's a wounded part of us, some type of trauma happens, and we really suffer some really difficult emotions around this: fear, anger, terror, sadness, but there's a deep hurt. And this typically happens when we are children. I would say that probably all of the examples that I've run into of chronic underspending can be traced back to some type of trauma, some type of wounding as a child. And of course, a child doesn't understand what's going on. They have no way to put this into perspective. So there's defense mechanisms built up around this wounding. There's parts of us that say, wow, this is never going to happen again. We are not going to be hurt like this again. And we adapt some type of belief system that's going to keep us from being hurt. So in the case of underspending, for example, it may be, let's just say that there is a trauma around going without. Maybe it was observed in the family. There was a lot of poverty potentially, and a lot of fear in that child, and fear that I will never want to feel the terror of how it feels to be without money ever again. And part of that can be adapting underspending. Now, again, it's one thing to be frugal, right? But we're talking about underspending when you have the money, when you have the means to provide for yourself and make things safe. So you have a protective part that just says, well, we're not going to spend money. Which could work really well, say, in the late teenage years, early 20s, when a person is struggling and typically doesn't have enough to do everything they want to do. But this behavior continues long past the point of needing to struggle. Another reason for underspending could be to avoid appearances of having money and the trauma around being shamed for having money. A feeling of not belonging, or being judged as evil, or not wanting to be criticized. So there's a part of us that protects this from happening and says we're never going to feel shame around that, of having the appearances that we have enough. So we'll keep ourselves poor. For example, maybe a deep feeling of not being worthy. And there's a protective part of us that says, stay small, stay hidden, be invisible. Because if you get big, meaning if you spend money or you spend money on these things, you're going to be seen and you'll be hurt. So we have a protective part that keeps us poor that way. I think I've talked in podcasts before of there's some folks that have learned to keep themselves poor because if they do save any money, it's going to be taken from them. So there's no point in saving up any money for necessities or a better car or things like that, because it just disappears. And maybe in their childhood, money did just disappear. I've had stories of parents that steal the child's money, or going bankrupt and the money disappears. So there's a number of reasons, always usually reasons that make perfect sense, that are very logical, why the person is underspending to the point that they're putting their safety at risk. So underspending is an issue. Underspending can be pretty serious. How do you know if you're an underspender versus just frugality? Well, do you avoid spending money on yourself or money on others? Do you have a lot of money saved, but you refuse to spend it out of fear? Do you routinely do things that, or turn down things that would make your life more comfortable, that would make things safer, that you could easily afford, but you tell yourself you can't afford them? Do you avoid participating in activities that you would enjoy, that would add to your quality of life, but you say, I can't afford it? And sometimes it takes a lot of looking, a lot of, what do I want to say, introspection, to know that you really can afford it, because you're so convinced you cannot. So if you have a financial planner or somebody in your life saying you've got the money, that really knows, and you're feeling poor and broke, that's a trailhead. That's something to be aware of. Another example of underspenders would be folks that just never quite have enough to feel secure. Not enough savings, not enough money, not enough supplies, not enough food in the freezer. Now that could potentially get into hoarding there. And I'm not talking about hoarding. I'm talking about you just don't feel that there's enough to be safe. And another one is just, as we've talked about before, denying yourself basic medical care. So if you see yourself in all of this, you could be like Scrooge and not necessarily be not grateful, or not be hard-hearted or hard-fisted. You can be the most wonderful person in the world and not be taking care of yourself. So how do you get out of this? Well, it's definitely realizing that this is an emotional issue, and it's not going to be solved by opening your checkbook and spending more, because you're not going to be able to do that, right? It really needs to be supported. It really needs to be something that's worked through, and I think it really starts with looking at the parts of yourself that are so frugal and so shame-based, or so afraid of these things. I do apologize for all the meowing and going on in the background. It takes looking deeper, looking at the emotional trails. And then I think the best way to do that, of course, is with financial therapy. So, okay, well, thanks for joining me today. And I look forward to seeing you next time.